Greetings, and welcome back to AUK Talks. My name is Dmitry Roman Kulchitsky, and welcome to our second episode. AUK Talks is an initiative created by the American University of Kuwait to offer our students, our faculty, and our community an opportunity to listen to and learn from career diplomats and Middle East experts about the challenges and opportunities facing diplomats in Kuwait, the region, and the world. Today we are honored to have with us Professor Dr. Hisham Al-Awadhi. Whereas we originally intended to begin exploring Kuwait's culture of diplomacy in our second episode, we thought it would be interesting to take a step back and focus on a topic in our second podcast that does not receive enough attention when trying to understand the special and unique relationship between the United States and Kuwait, namely the impact of American presence before the discovery of oil. To help us explore this topic, Professor Hisham has agreed to talk about the history of the American community in Kuwait. Professor Al-Awadhi is a professor of history and international relations in the Department of International Relations at AUK. Professor Al-Awadhi's research interests include the history of the modern Middle East and ideas and social trends in the Arab Gulf. He holds a PhD in Middle Eastern politics from the University of Exeter, a master's in historical studies from the University of Cambridge, and an MA in international relations from the University of Kent. Professor Al-Awadhi's books include The History of Slaves in the Arabian Gulf, Muslim Brothers in Pursuit of Legitimacy, Power and the Political Islam in Egypt under Mubarak, and most recently, All the Rage, How Ideas Diffuse in Kuwait, first published in Arabic and now recently translated into English. Professor Hisham, Ahlan wa sahlan. Thank you for joining us today. So let's begin. My first question. Professor Hisham, can you give us some background of what inspired you to explore this very interesting topic?
Well, let me at the beginning thank you, Professor Roman, for having me. It's a pleasure. The stereotype when you begin by saying the history of Americans in Kuwait, there is this kind of immediate stereotype that the kind of relationship we are talking about is the political. It's the one that is associated with oil. Prior to that, any European connection was to Britain. So I wanted to challenge that and explore and make the argument that the American presence in the Gulf and in Kuwait in particular actually goes way before oil and presented itself in multiple facets, including education, religion, culture, social interaction with the broader society. Only during the 70s, with the withdrawal and decolonization, with the withdrawal of Britain from the Middle East, does this power vacuum begins to be created, and naturally it was then filled from the 70s onward with the United States.
Well, can you give us some idea about the early travelers from America to Kuwait?
So in the past, what made Kuwait unique was its port. And that port was a focal point of attraction to all the kind of foreign streamers coming, say, from India, from Persia. And there was this interesting streamer that was coming from India. And on its board was one of the travelers. His name was Lusher. And Lusher wrote an interesting book about his travels. And he went all over the place. He went to Bombay, he went to Muscat, he went to Basra in Iraq, and ultimately final destination was Istanbul. Luckily enough, the streamer stopped at Kuwait, which was for the first time that happened. And luckily, the ruler at the time in 1868 invited Lusher to come and spend the night in Kuwait. We are so grateful for that ruler because only because of his invitation do we see this kind of memoir about Kuwait through Lusher, through an American person. And what is fascinating, Professor Roman, when you read the memoirs, is that he blends in this American culture and American perspective into looking into the Orient and into the Gulf and into the Arab people. He describes women, he describes men. One of the things that is a little bit ironic and controversial to some is that he says, I haven't seen the women in Kuwait because a lot of them were covered, but I've been told, even by Turks and by Persians, that Kuwaiti women is among the stunning women in the Gulf compared to, say, Muscat and Qatar. And he begins to talk about the streets, the boats, the culture, the food, the dress. Very meticulous account, very vivid, very colorful. Until today, Kuwaiti historians, believe it or not, when they narrate Kuwait's history, they use Lusher as one of the prime sources.
So you would say, so in terms of his establishing his presence and being able to articulate his experience, motivated other Americans to come to Kuwait. So what would have been the next wave of Americans coming to Kuwait?
So there was the next wave, I would say, the religious. You have somebody called Samuel Zwimmer, who is very active in the Protestant church, the Dutch church based in New Jersey in the United States. He begins in a way like Martin Luther, or maybe like John the Baptist. He has this dream of spreading Christianity. And he's so specific in his goal, he's actually targeting Central Arabia. He's not targeting the coasts. He's not at all thinking about Basra, Muscat, or Kuwait. He's actually thinking about spreading Christianity in Central Arabia. But he knows very well that it's very difficult to penetrate into the desert, the fanatic tribes, or the hardcore conservative values among the tribes. So he begins to think coast, ports. Let us have these kind of stations where we establish missions. So he started establishing, very active person, very enthusiastic, established a mission in Muscat, established a mission in Bahrain, established a mission in Basra. And he would always think about two things. He would think about whether the British control that area, and this is an interesting relationship whereby Zwimmer knows that the British are here for political reasons, far from religious, but because they are Christians, they are going to understand and they are going to support us. And the British, on the other hand, see the American mission as an opportunity to beautify their ugly imperial face.
But when you're talking about missionaries coming and with the attempt to convert the local population, could you give us a sense of the blowback that he would have received from in Kuwait, and actually how he dealt with the complexity of trying to convert individuals in Kuwait, given the fact that we're dealing with Christianity and you're dealing with Islam? Could you talk about that?
I think he found it extremely challenging, very difficult, and that's why I think that he began to think about ways in which his mission could be acceptable. And the way he thought about it is to provide services. So he looked into the medical quality that was available at the time and thought it was extremely primitive. People were dying prematurely. Young women are getting married and pregnant at an early age. They are having midwives who are well versed in traditional medicine, but not your updated medicine, losing their lives. Children that are not living for a long, period or as expected because they catch diseases that they need to be vaccinated against. So he thought, if we can bring medical doctors who are wearing two hats, the hat of a missionary, but the more visible hat to the local community is the medical hat, then once we do this service, and I think this is to do with Jesus Christ's miracles. One of the things that made Jesus Christ attractive, appealing, is his miracles. He could heal the sick, he could resurrect the dead, and once he does this to those people, they begin to fall in love with him because he didn't just preach, but he provided services. I think Zwimmer was inspired by the Christian model, and he thought that if we can provide these kind of services, quote-unquote miracles, people will ultimately be excited, interested, and hopefully, fingers crossed, converted.
One of the things that I'm curious about is where exactly did these Americans come from? Because you're talking about them as missionaries. They realized that the complexities of the region, the communities, and responded by creating this means of providing medical care, support, and so forth. I'm curious, where exactly does in terms of the narrative of the American experience, where exactly did this wave of missionaries come from the United States? Do they talk about this?
Yes, specifically New Jersey.
New Jersey?
New Jersey, yes. This is where the Dutch Protestant church was based. In New Jersey, they would hold an annual meeting. They would inform the patrons, well-off patrons. A lot of them were hardcore Protestant Christians that were so committed to spreading Christianity, particularly in the world of the Orient, which at the time included India, Turkey, Persia, and the Middle East and the Arab world. They would solicit funding. They would say, listen, we need to establish a station in Basra. Would you like to fund that? We need to establish a mission in Jeddah. Would you like to fund that? And they would give a presentation to the patrons and say, this is Jeddah, it has a particular population, and this is what it means to Christianity if we have a station in Jeddah. And if they get the proper funding, they would then dispatch somebody who will pay a visit and stay for a couple of days, do a field work, interview the people, and see whether the place is inviting, feasible. And then they would collect and solicit more money, and then they will establish a small settlement composed of a medical doctor, a nurse, and a couple of Bibles that they will begin to spread.
Could you give us a sense of, as the Americans are coming over, the role of the American government? Because I'm curious, because when you're dealing with people coming over and living here and providing support, was there any support from the American government in terms of consular support, in terms of missions, let's say, because I would think that with Americans, they need services, they need some support. Did the American government play any role in this?
In the initial stage of the mission, we do not see, at least from my reading, we do not see a visible, formal backup from the government. This was an institutional initiative based on the religious institution such as churches. I think, Professor Roman, the American government would come in the third phase of the American presence, and that is very much linked with the discovery of oil.
I was just thinking, because you're dealing with social support, but when we think of Kuwait in the contemporary sense, everyone thinks about oil. So you can talk about the transition from the second wave to the wave that came in terms of I would believe 1930s, 1940s.
Exactly.
During the time when oil was discovered and became a major resource for Kuwait versus what the kind of economic activity that existed beforehand.
Indeed. One needs, of course, to bear in mind, and this is a reminder for our audiences, that Kuwait has been historically connected to the British since 1899. This is the year, marks the year in which the ruler of Kuwait then signed an agreement to protect trade agreement with the British, whereby the British become responsible for the security of Kuwait. So when oil was discovered, this agreement, of course, would remain until Kuwait's independence, 1961. You rightly say so that oil was discovered in the 1930s, so the British at the time were the ones that were controlling Kuwait's affairs, including oil. And for the first time, you begin to see now American oil companies are developing an interest in investing in the Middle East. Initially, they go to Iran. When they come to the Gulf, they approach Ibn Saud, who is the rising star in Arabia. But Kuwait, as if it was politically and economically wedded to Britain. And they begin, this is an ironic story, they begin to lure and seduce the ruler of Kuwait, Sheikh Ahmed Al-Jaber, who is of course the father of the current Emir of Kuwait. They begin to seduce him by making offers that would be competing with the British offers. And Sheikh Ahmed Al-Jaber would be confused and saying, I love the British, they take the priority, but here are the Americans are providing me with a competitive. So the British begin to feel that the Americans are a threat, and if you can't, beat them, join them. So they begin to found a new company called the Kuwait Oil Company, which is a merger between the British company and the American company. And based on that merger, you begin to have this influx of American workers coming to an area called Ahmadi. And that marks the third phase of American presence.
So if we're in the 1940s right now, I'm thinking in terms of Arab nationalism, for example, emerges in the 1950s, for example. I'm curious how that kind of plays into the American experience, because on one hand you have the influx of, and actually the Americans, I presume, are coming from Texas.
Right.
They're coming from those areas where
Right.
oil is really the economic activity of choice.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about the 1950s. We have the American presence. We have the British along with the Americans that are beginning to work together. And then suddenly we have this wave of Arab nationalism,
Yeah.
which emerges in the 1950s,
Yeah.
goes to the 60s. Could you talk a little bit about how that affected the American experience?
So, at that stage, to my mind, Arab nationalism was anti-British. Arab nationalism was anti-imperialism, and the two pillars of imperialism in the Middle East were the French and the British. So the Americans were the good guys during that stage. So you can become an Arab nationalist as much as you want, but you will not necessarily be anti-American as a result. Right? So the victims of Arab nationalism were the British. And I think, ironically, the Americans benefited from that, because the more the British lost in terms of credit and started to dissociate themselves from the region, the more the beneficiaries were the Americans, who began to expand and make a more visible presence in the region, except that this time it's more political, not just religious or cultural.
Speaking of political, if we're looking at events and how these events have impacted the evolution of the American presidents, I'm thinking we're in the late 60s and in the 70s, we had the Islamic Revolution.
Right.
Could you talk, how did that affect the American experience in Kuwait, for example?
So that's interesting. And Professor Roman, what to my mind is interesting about the American narrative is that it is the formula in diverse numbers. Meaning, look at how many events we spoke about, and this is what is interesting about this topic. We have actually narrated Kuwait history, Middle Eastern history, because we spoke about what? We spoke about oil, we spoke about Nasser, we spoke about Saudi Arabia, but the constant number or the paradigm or the lens was the American presence, and that's what makes the American narrative very interesting. You can narrate Arab, Middle Eastern history using the American paradigm or lens. So now, during the late 60s, with the debacle or the Nakba of the 1967 war between Israel and Egypt, and the 1973 another war between Egypt and Israel, America begins to be the target now. The British are gone. Kuwait gained its independence in 1961. The British departed the region entirely. Bahrain got its independence in 1971. The United Arab Emirates was founded as a new state in 1971. Gone are the British. The Americans are coming now, initially very handsome, smart, beautiful face, apolitical, but they become politicized with Israel. So whenever a war happens between Israel and the Arabs, the Americans tend to tilt on the Israeli side. And here the Arabs, for the first time, begin to look at the Americans in the same way that their forefathers perceived the British during the 50s and the 60s.
Speaking of the 60s, and I know we're talking about the Islamic Revolution period, but something that just came to mind to me was that Kuwait petitioned to be a member of the United Nations in the 1960s, and there were some problems there because Iraq stood opposed to that, and it took a couple of years for that to actually complete. Could you give us a little bit of some background on the American experience with regard to that period?
Yeah. So when you say 1960s, one of the things that we could also include is the Cold War and all the politics of the Cold War. So in 1961, Kuwait got its independence. It immediately wanted to situate themselves and position themselves as an independent state that has international recognition. So they applied for membership in the United Nations. Their application was being vetoed by the USSR, that was using Kuwait to something that is close to a proxy war to score points against the United States. United States, which was like-minded to the British, wanted to see that Gulf countries become natural members of the United Nations. The USSR saw the Gulf countries as potential enemies to the USSR, and saw Iraq, on the other hand, that had a military coup that brought somebody called Qasim, Abdul Karim Qasim, in 1958 as a pro-USSR. So every time Kuwait wanted to apply for its independence, the USSR saw this as a loss to Iraq and they vetoed it.
Interesting.
Only in 1963, when there was other things happening in the world to do with the Cold War, that the USSR thought, you know, this year and the coming year, we don't want to create trouble for the USA because we want to cooperate on other issues, that they then didn't veto Kuwait, and Kuwait became a member in the 1963. So the Cold War is the main primary explanation as to the delay of Kuwait's membership in the United Nations.
Interesting. And speaking of the Cold War and the relationship with the United States and the USSR, we're looking at 1980, the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So could you speak a little bit about that impact on the American experience in Kuwait?
I think one needs to understand when it comes to Kuwait and its relations with America throughout the decades, including the Cold War and including the 1980s, one needs to bear in mind Kuwait's size. And in this context, size does matter. Kuwait is a small country, relatively. It's sandwiched between three regional powers, namely Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. As much as Kuwait, you know, needs to be courageous and daring, and rightly so, it needs also to be very careful, very cautious. And this was the prime reason as to why Kuwait during the 80s declared itself as a non-alliance to either the USSR and the USA. Maybe maybe in a tendency-wise, it was tilting towards the Americans, but it didn't want to be seen as either on the camp of America, so as not to displease some countries, perhaps including Iraq. Neither would be seen on the other camp, so as not to displease Iran at the time before the revolution, and Saudi Arabia.
Before we talk about the revolution, or at least the next would be the Iraq-Iran war.
Yeah.
But what's very interesting here is, by what you're saying, you're kind of establishing this kind of starting point or trigger for the reputation of Kuwait in terms of Kuwait's diplomatic culture.
Right.
And that is, it's seen as a mediator. It sees as someone who tries to mediate and resolve a problem. Rather than to take an active role, it's more of a role of mediator. And so you're suggesting that part of that, or that where it became part of Kuwait's DNA, so to speak,
Yeah.
it's starting with it sees itself in terms of a small country surviving and dealing with the challenges, and it sees that the most strategic, most effective way that it could survive and make a difference is through mediation. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, so the size is important, and you know, there has been all kind of literature explaining Kuwait's diplomacy and what are the incentives behind its diplomacy. I would say its size, its geography, but I would also say, would like to argue, take a broader perspective, its history. So, you know, we don't want to seem as, you know, flirting with that, but Kuwait has a unique history in the sense that the ruling family didn't come as invaders. They came as early migrant settlers. They needed to mediate with the community, a sort of political organization, the concept of consultation shura, which ultimately developed into the National Assembly. My point is that the local politics in Kuwait also helped shape Kuwait's diplomacy in using mediation rather than coercive power, yes, because the coercion is not in the early DNA of the ruling family.
Interesting. Well, can you kind of relate that to the next, I guess, movement that would have been the Iran-Iraq war that followed?
The Iraq-Iran war, to my mind, marked the 80s as one of the worst decades in Kuwait's history, and indeed in the Gulf and in the Arab world. A war that took place between two regional powers, namely Iraq and Iran, from 1980 all the way till 88. So we are talking about 90% of that decade. What happened was that for the first time, and this is, I think, is unprecedented in Kuwait's history, you have a division in Kuwait society. You have part of society that is siding with Iran, and thinking that the Iranian Revolution is a movement for liberation from tyranny, from backwardness, from monarchical backward regimes. And you have those then who began to side with Iraq, to see Iraq as a secular, progressive movement that is not anti-religious, but anti-mullahs or conservative, reactionary, disturbing new development in the region. Kuwait initially wanted to play a mediating role. Initially, in the first couple of years, it couldn't, it failed, and therefore saw itself, the government that is, tilting towards Iraq. So for the first time, there was this division in society that translated into terrorist activities, hijacking planes. On one occasion in 1985, an attempt to assassinate the emir. Now, some would argue that these terrorist activities were local, but they had foreign hands, they had regional funding. So much so that the emir was threatened, a lot of Kuwaitis were threatened, that for the first time, the National Assembly was dissolved unconstitutionally. It wasn't the first time, because there was another one in 1976. But this had this dramatic impact. And Professor Roman, Kuwait, believe it or not, the beacon of democracy in the Gulf, remained without this democratic institution from 1986 till 1992, exactly because of the Iraq-Iran war. How did this impact the American presence? Well, you would know better, because when the Iranian Revolution happened, the first thing that the Iranians did was to go and occupy the American embassy, because America was seen as the big devil that was supporting this corrupt ruler called Mohammad Rida Pahlavi, or the Shah of Iran. This automatically impacted the American embassy in Kuwait, so much so that the American ambassador started fortifying the American embassy in Kuwait. There was a demonstration by some Iranians in Kuwait at the time, including some Kuwaitis that had leanings to Iran. We are told in the literature that the American embassy began to have underground exits that would enable the ambassador at any time to escape, so what happened in Tehran would not happen in Kuwait. That put the Kuwaiti government under tremendous pressure, because suddenly it saw itself as responsible for the American security.
And where was, I'm curious, where was the American embassy at that time?
It was in an area that is today called Mishraf.
So Mishraf, so there's potentially some tunnels beneath those areas in some homes.
Arguably,
interesting.
Yeah,
That would be interesting for some students or interesting people to kind of explore that. That's fascinating.
Tunnels, CCTV cameras, obviously at the time, of course. They fortified the walls so that the walls become impenetrable to the cars that might carry bombs. I think you begin to have a militarized embassy only because of what has happened in Tehran.
Well, in terms of the timetable, you brought us up to 1992, and we all know what happened around that period of time. So can you talk a little bit about the invasion of Saddam Hussein, or of Iraq, of Kuwait?
Well, that's relatively easy, because now this, till today, is vivid in the minds of many Kuwaitis. It is remembered every 2nd of August. So although it took place 1990, people still remember it till today. Elders speak to the youngsters about it. It's commemorated every year. So what happened was that when the invasion happened, Kuwait, the non-allying country that it has been since the Cold War, did not rush to call the Americans to come to the rescue of Kuwait. It wanted to appeal first to the Arab nation, like it did in the 1961. So it appealed to the Arab League. The Arab League was not forthcoming as it was during the 60s. In the 60s, it was headed by Nasser. There was a competition between Nasser and Abdel Karim Qasim for power and popularity. So it was relatively understood why Nasser rushed to actually aid Kuwait to raise his popularity even more in the region against Qasim. In the 1990s, the Arab League was in chaos. There was no unified Arab leadership. Kuwait waited and waited for the Arab League to send its army. No army was dispatched. Only then did Kuwait begin reluctantly but forcibly to actually invite the Americans, who were, by the way, already were in the region because they were invited by Saudi Arabia.
Well, that's interesting. So in terms of American presence, I would think that after the liberation, the degree of Americanization, or the degree of the American presence must have transformed, must have went to another level. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I think the moment the Americans began to become involved in the invasion and the aftermath of the invasion, it began to not just confine itself to the political, military stance or perspective. I think there was this role now that we need to have a cultural role in Kuwait. So they were, and remember, there is no National Assembly, so George Bush Sr. at the time started to push in a polite way for democracy, restoring the constitution, restoring the parliament, and empowering women and giving women in Kuwait their political right. The United States, rightly so, wanted to be seen in front of the American voter as not entering into a war between two tyrants. Because how is Kuwait different from Iraq if both don't have democratic institutions? So George Bush Sr. said to the ruler of Kuwait at the time, please help me distinguish to my voter between Kuwait and Iraq. So what should we do? Well, bring back the constitution, bring back the parliament. And there was this kind of promise, a new social contract that was drafted between the rulers of Kuwait and the people, that as soon as the country is liberated, will bring back them democratic institutions. So the American role, yes, helped liberate Kuwait, but I think it should not be reduced to merely the political and the military.
Fascinating. Well, if in terms of kind of where we are now, so in terms of the agents of socialization, the democratization, or the message that democracy, or the idea of a democracy brings with it, in terms of not just a political system, but also from a political cultural point of view, where are we today in terms of America and Kuwait in the present sense, in the present day?
This is a very difficult question because it has a lot of turning points from the 1990s onwards till today. I mean, the world has seen a lot of changes. We see now, and you're aware of this more than I am, the rise of Russia, for example, as a competing polar against the United States. We see the rise of China. So the United States is not alone anymore as the sole power as it was in the 1990s. And surely GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, are beginning not to dissociate themselves from America as a strategic partner, but they are entertaining other options. Also oil, I think, in the future of oil and global warming, a lot of things now are, creating a non-orthodox traditional way into looking into power politics. As far as young people are concerned, the American presence has aided the idea of globalization, consumerism, cultural influence. But even that now is not confined to the American influence. With TikTok and others, young people in Kuwait listen to Korean music, they eat Indian food. So America, to my mind, is still a dominant power, but it's not the only power. And I think this needs, another AUK talk.
Okay, well, with everything that was said, how would you, in terms of in conclusion, and summarize this Americanization, or this American presence, starting from the very beginning with the early travelers to where we are today, in terms of the kind of the transition of going from social to political, social to political? How would you summarize it?
It's very difficult, Professor Roman. I think the initial presence of the Americans was something that had more of a consensus. People welcomed the American presence because they were curious people, they were travelers, they were just coming here to observe and write and document. Even when they were coming for a religious reason, they came and established AUB, they came and established universities. And whenever there was a battle in Kuwait, there was one famous battle in 1921, over 400 injured people, they were treated in the American hospital. So people appreciated the American presence because the American presence was here to provide services related to the well-being of the society. Slowly but surely, the American presence became more problematic because oil entered into the equation, party politics in the United States, the 9/11, the rise of fundamentalism. It's not that America has lost interest in democratization in the Middle East, but democracy is, the Arab Spring, democracy is not anymore a priority in the discourse of it's more about security, peace, even if some Arab countries are dominated by authoritarian rulers. So the world has changed, America has changed, and to my mind, the Arabs, people in the Gulf, including Kuwaitis, are for sure to echo this change and respond accordingly.
It's fascinating. Well, Dr. Hisham, Professor Hisham, this has been a fascinating learning experience, and I'm sure not just for our students, not just for our AUK community, and anyone else interested in what's happening in the Gulf, and I can sincerely say it's been a learning experience for me. It's fascinating, and I hope that we at AUK have an opportunity to explore this even deeper, where we can begin providing some sort of resources, opportunities for learning for our students about this experience. Because we are, in the end, the American University of Kuwait. So this concludes the second episode of AUK Talks. Next month, we will return to our normally scheduled programming and begin exploring the evolution of Kuwait's culture of diplomacy. So stay tuned.